The game of the day is, once again, Final Fantasy XIV, and I am not a good monk. I'm going to be making a video here today, hopefully brief, explaining to everybody that hasn't played Final Fantasy XIV or hasn't played Monk what exactly it is that I'm doing in these videos and what all my buttons there do. And then for the people that do know what's going on, I'm going to be explaining why I'm bad at it. So, as a quick introduction for those of you who aren't in the know of how Monk works, despite that I have a fair number of buttons here, Monk generally works with combos, I suppose you could say. And what that is after I use one ability, it lets me then use a second one. After I use one of those, it lets me use a third one. This is actually why I have my abilities tapered here, or tapered isn't the right word, offset here. That helps me keep it straight in my head, because I had a very hard time keeping them straight. I would often hit the wrong button in the next combo set, or try to hit a button that was locked, or I'd go back to the first set, and I just messed up constantly when they were all lined up evenly. So I offset them a little bit, and now it's much easier for me to wrap my brain around. But you see, of all my abilities, these 6 here are grayed out. And that's because these 3 here all go to the first, these attack. These will open the combo. These 3 can then be used after one of these 3, and these 3 can then be used after one of these 3. More specifically, how this works is, you'll notice this one says, it changes form to Raptor. Now, these 3 abilities can only be used while I'm in Raptor form, but they change my form to the Coral form. And then these 3 abilities, say, can only be used while in Coral form, but they change form to Oppo form. Which brings us back to the beginning. Now, these abilities, though they don't require you being in Oppo form to use, they will often grant a special bonus if you are, such as Dragon Kick here, that if you happen to be in Oppo form, will reduce the target's blunt damage resistance by 10%, which is kind of nice. So my general attacking will be to cycle through these various combos. Now, as to what each attack in these does, the first one, the one on the far left, is always a direct attack. It does little more than does damage, and that would be Boot Shine here, as well as True Strike and Snap Punch. Then the second one, Dragon Kick, Twin Snakes, and Demolish, all add either some kind of buff to me or debuff to the enemy. And then the third one is my AoE and Miscellaneous. I have Arm of the Destroyer, which will do an area effect around me. Then I have One Ilm Punch, which One Ilm Punch removes 1 beneficial status from the target. I'm going to be honest, I have never used this attack, unless I clicked it by accident. And then finally Rock Breaker, which will do a conal attack in front of me. Now, for the most part, Monk's AoEs do very little damage, especially for the TP cost that they have, and in turn, I would suggest almost never using AoEs. Even if we are dealing with a large number of enemies, I'll just single target them down one at a time. I think I've maybe used Arm of the Destroyer on occasion, since it has an Oppo form bonus of silencing the enemy for 1 second, which is good for interrupting some spells. And I'll generally use it if maybe there's a lot of very weak enemies around me, but other than that, I generally never mess with any of these third ones, so I pretty much limit myself to the first 2 of each set. Now to the rest of the attacks here, and a little more of an explanation as to what's going on with Monk. My 4 abilities up top here, Fracture, Blood for Blood, Invigorate, and Bloodbath, those are all based on other classes. Those are all abilities that I've inherited from other classes. Of them, Fracture and Blood for Blood are perhaps the ones I'll be using most commonly, Invigorate is my, oh crap, I ran out of TP button, which I don't think I mentioned before, but using all of these attacks does cost TP. That's the cost in the lower left corner. You see this one costs 130, and you see my gauge go down. Now that gauge does refill over time, but when you're wailing on an enemy, you can run out of TP, and that's what Invigorate's for. And finally, Bloodbath, which will get me a little bit of health back if I absolutely need it. But as to the attacks that Monk does specifically, I've got a number of them over here. Of course, this is my Chocobo and Sprint, which I will never be using in combat. I mentioned I'm very bad at Monk, and that's where Perfect Balance comes in. Perfect Balance is one of the mainstays of Monks, and one of the most debatable ways to maximize your DPS. I don't use Perfect Balance at all. I know I should, I just don't, because I can't keep that kind of crap straight in my head. What Perfect Balance does is it allows the execution of a weapon skill, which requires a certain form, without being in that form. For example, I could use Perfect Balance, and then immediately use Snap Punch. 4 times. That's where that check comes in. Now the ones next to it are healing abilities. I have Second Wind, which will heal myself. Mantra, which makes all curing done near me more potent, so it's helpful if like everybody got hit with something. But for the most part, these are things that I won't be using regularly in combat. Then I have these 3 down here, which are my various stances. I have Fists of Earth, which, while Fists of Earth is active, I take less damage, so it's good if I'm tanking for whatever reason. Then I have Fists of Fire, which is good for when I'm doing damage. You'll pretty much always see me with Fists of Fire on while I'm fighting. And then finally, Fists of Wind, which Fists of Wind makes me move faster, so it's good when I'm running around town, or whatever. Now, that aside, I also have a couple abilities over here, specifically Haymaker, which, after I evade an attack, I can then hit the enemy back with Haymaker. This is very nice for if I'm soloing, because otherwise I'm not going to be tanking much, and I shouldn't be getting hit much. Add to that, when I'm not tanking and I have the mobility to get around the enemy, I can do enough damage that the potency 170 that Haymaker does is really nothing special. So as long as I'm in a party, I'll pretty much never use Haymaker. Then we have Featherfoot over here, which again is good for if I'm soloing, increases my evasion. And then we're brought to the attacks that I will potentially use in a party. For one, we have Shoulder Tackle, which Shoulder Tackle is good for closing distances. It will also add a quick stun effect to the enemy. I generally never use it for the stun effect, but it is good for closing gaps. As far as stuns are concerned, I also have Steel Peak here, which is a very quick stun. I'll occasionally use that if the need arises. Now, those are mostly I'll use if the need arises abilities. Next up, let's actually talk about what I actually do while I'm fighting. And that's where these 4 abilities over here come from, as well as Howling Fist. And this is all outside of my regular combo. You see, Fracture is a damage over time attack. With a potency of 100, the damage over time potency then does 20 for 18 seconds. Now what that means is it will do a potency 20 attack every 3 seconds for 18 seconds. Now many people say Fracture isn't actually worth it, and on other classes, like Dragoon, I can see that not being worth it. But for Monk, a lot of our attacks are very low potency attacks. Some of our most powerful ones are maybe like 210. And the total potency from Fracture is actually better than most any of our other attacks, so it is worth it. For us. Touch of Death is another damage over time. It has a initial damage of 20, but then it has damage over time potency of 25 for 30 seconds, so that's a much more substantial amount of damage compared to Fracture, which, though Fracture is worth it, it is also our weakest damage over time. Then we have Blood for Blood, which I just recently got Blood for Blood, if you want to know how bad a monk I am. And that is a very nice bonus to damage, 10% damage increased, but then I also take more damage in turn. So good to use when I know I'm not going to get hit a lot. Internal Release is another buff I put on myself, which increases critical hit rate by 30%. And then Howling Fist, which is just straight up damage. But it is directional damage, so I can hit more than one enemy with it. So be careful not to tick off something you shouldn't be ticking off. But it's some nice extra bonus damage. Now, a real quick mention of how fighting in this game works. All abilities have a cooldown of sorts, and many abilities are on what's called the global cooldown, which is after I use that attack, you'll see how many other abilities' timer goes down. All of those were on global cooldown, so I have to wait for that global cooldown to go away before I can use, say, True Strike to continue my combo. Now, these three abilities here, Blood for Blood, Internal Release, and Howling Fist, are not on the global cooldown, so you want to weave those between your regular attacks. So I can say, hit Boot Shine, and then while I'm waiting for this global cooldown, I can tick off Blood for Blood. And then True Strike should be ready by the time I get that one done. Now, as for my main combo, I mentioned before, I've got two real combo sets. Boot Shine to True Strike to Snap Punch is all strictly damage, whereas Dragon Kick to Twin Snakes to Demolish is all various damage over time effects. Also keeping in mind that Fracture and Touch of Death are damage over time. Now that you have some vague idea what exactly it is that I'm doing, let me tell you why I'm bad at Monk. Now, first and foremost, I don't use perfect balance. I know I should, but I don't. And that's because I simply can't keep it straight in my head. The rotation, the optimal rotation, when to use it, how to use it, I just can't get it right in my head. I know I need to just practice with it and sit down, and maybe I'll get a handle on it at some point. But for me, for the most part, I just don't use it. And that's actually where the most debate comes from as to optimizing Monk's DPS. Now, another reason I am also bad at Monk is because, of course, the first thing I'm going to want to do when I start attacking a new enemy is put all my damage over time attacks on him. That makes sense to me. However, Dragon Kick here reduces or requires my Oppo form in order to put the effect on them, which means I need to go through a combo once before Dragon Kick will actually put an effect on the enemy. That's something I can't keep straight in my head. Knowing that, like, oh, I can do all of this, but I have to remember to go back to do that later, I can't do that. I simply cannot keep it straight in my head. And in turn, the first thing I do is open up with all my damage over time attacks, but I also open up with Dragon Kick. But I don't actually put the Dragon Kick effect on them until the next time I get around to that rotation, because I can't keep it straight in my head otherwise, which means I'm going a substantial time without Dragon Kick active. That's also why I'm a bad monk. Now, another reason I am a bad monk is we have a fair number of various buffs and debuffs. As I mentioned before, we have the middle three here, as well as Fracture and Touch of Death. Now, what I should be doing as a good monk is watching the duration effect of all of these on the target. And as soon as one runs out, immediately put the effect back on them. I don't do that, because I can't keep all that straight in my head. So instead, what I do is I put all of my damage over time effects on them at the same time. And then I wait 2 rotations. So I'll do my damage over time rotation, and then I'll do my strict damage rotation twice. Because after 2 rotations of my strict damage over time combo, most of the damage over time effects will have worn off. And so I put them all back on. This is not efficient use of these, but it helps me keep it straight in my head. And that is why I'm a bad monk. Personally, I try to make up for the fact that I'm a bad monk by not dying, because I don't care what your DPS is or how good you are at doing those rotations. If you're dead, I'm doing more damage than you. So once again, a quick show of what I'm actually doing here. Another thing mentioned before, and why this is different soloing than if I'm working in a party. You see, if I'm soloing, I'm generally always facing the enemy, and the enemy is facing me. Whereas a lot of these attacks actually do more or less damage depending on where you're standing. Boot Shine, if I'm in Oppo form, will always do critical damage from behind. Dragon Kick needs to be done from the side in order to do the most damage. So, as a quick rundown of what it is that I do when I get the chance, I will usually open with Dragon Kick on the side, followed by Fracture, followed by Twin Snakes, followed by Touch of Death, then get behind them for Demolish. Now I've got all my damage over time effects on them. Now I'm ready to strictly do damage, and that's where I Blood for Blood, to Boot Shine, to Internal Release, to True Strike, to Howling Fist just for a little extra damage, and then to the side for Snap Punch. Now that I've gone through that once, I can go behind them and do my strict damage thing again. Boot Shine, to True Strike, to Snap Punch, since all of these are on cooldown now. And with that done, you can see most of my effects have worn off, so I can go back to Dragon Kick, Fracture, to Twin Snakes, to Touch of Death, and then back in behind to Demolish, and then I just do my Boot Shine to True Strike, to Snap Punch, and then I would do that once more before going back to my Dragon Kick, Fracture, Twin Snakes, yada yada yada. I will watch the cooldowns for these, weave them in whenever I get the chance as soon as one runs up. But that's about it. That's what I do, and I know it's not perfect, but it's what I can keep straight in my head. I have a hard enough time doing what I do. So until next time, everyone, this has been me showing you why exactly I'm a bad monk.